The war in Ukraine wasn't supposed to go like this. It was meant to be a quick invasion, over in a matter of weeks, that would allow Russia's President Vladimir Putin to take territory that he believes should have been Russia's all along. It almost worked. Russia managed to fight to the edges of Kyiv before being pushed back. Ukraine's resistance was stronger than he expected. But no matter, his soldiers could regroup, consolidate their gains, and then push again with renewed force. Except that's not what happened. In addition to Ukraine fighting more fervently than Putin could ever anticipate, support came pouring into the country from all over the world. Suddenly, the small Ukrainian military was being bolstered by modern weapons that enabled it to fight more effectively against Russia. As of May 2024, Ukraine has managed to reclaim 54% of the territory that Russia captured during its initial invasion, leaving Russia occupying just 18% of the country. The war is now one of attrition. If Russia does manage to win, it'll achieve a Pyrrhic victory for a simple reason. The war has become a meat grinder for Russian soldiers, a meat grinder that's so intense that Russia now finds itself losing up to 1,000 soldiers per day as Putin's approach devolves into sending more and more people to the front in the hope of overwhelming Ukraine's forces. That brings us to the question we'll answer in this video. Why is this happening? How has Russia gone from nearly taking Ukraine within a few weeks to getting locked into a war in which it's losing so many soldiers daily? To answer that simple question, we must first dig into the reports that claim Russia is losing so many of its people. Toward the end of June 2024, Business Insider published an article in which it went into depth about Russia's current rate of losses. Quoting the New York Times, it says that officials from the UK, US, and other Western intelligence agencies all agree that Russia's approach of attacking Ukraine's defenses head-on is costing them 1,000 soldiers per day. The UK believes it may even be higher, placing Russia's losses at 1,200 soldiers per day in May 2024. These are the highest numbers that have been reported since the beginning of the war, and they're adding up. The UK believes that Russia has lost 500,000 soldiers to death or injury since February 2022. The US is a bit more conservative in its estimates. It places the number at 350,000. But either way, it's clear that Russia has lost far more soldiers than it planned to lose. After all, the country had called up 300,000 reservists to its army in September 2022. Whichever figure is correct, that reserve force has almost been entirely depleted. The reports come amidst Russia intensifying its attacks on Ukrainian positions in the Kyiv region. Ukraine's second-largest city is a key target for Putin, both strategically and symbolically. On the latter front, Russia would score a major propaganda victory over Ukraine by taking its second city, dealing a blow to Ukrainian morale in the process. It could build from this victory, reinforcing the notion that nothing can stop its military from taking Kyiv. At the very least, taking Kyiv means Putin will be in an even stronger position should negotiations for a ceasefire commence. On the more practical side, Kyiv is home to Ukraine's largest natural gas reserves, meaning the region is key to keeping Ukraine self-sustaining on the energy front. It's also a major contributor to Ukraine's economy. It was Ukraine's third largest contributor to gross domestic product in 2019, accounting for 6.3%. That places it behind only Dnipropetrovsk and Kyiv in terms of its economic importance. Putin really wants Kyiv. To claim it, he's willing to throw soldier after soldier at Ukrainian fortifications, with seemingly no regard for the number who are killed. Also reporting on the New York Times article, the Kyiv Independent shares a key quote. "It is a style of warfare that Russian soldiers have likened to being put into a meat grinder, with commanding officers seemingly oblivious to the fact that they are sending infantry soldiers to die." All of this brings us back to the question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why is this happening? There are several answers to that question, starting with the most important. Throwing soldier after soldier at a problem has worked for Russia before, so Putin believed that it would work again when he tried to take Kyiv. Take the Battle of Avdiivka as an example. Russia waged that battle between October 10, 2023 and February 17, 2024. That's a total of 130 days in which Russia took much the same approach to taking the fortified town as it's taking in Kyiv, throw soldier after soldier at it. Estimates vary on how many men Russia lost when taking Avdiivka, with Business Insider quoting a Russian military blogger as claiming the number was somewhere in the region of 16,000, along with 300 armored vehicles. Ukraine's military says the number is much higher. It claims Russia lost 47,000 soldiers when trying to take Avdiivka. That amounts to losses of around 360 per day. Granted, that's not as high as what we're seeing as Russia tries to take Kyiv. However, Avdiivka is a much smaller territory, meaning Putin appears to have simply scaled up his approach because he's seen the meat grinder work before. The battle for Bakhmut was just as damaging to Russia. Though Russia was able to declare victory in May 2023, after fighting to claim the city for close to a year, it lost thousands of soldiers in the process. Newsweek reported that Russia lost around 100,000 soldiers in just 4 months while making its final push for the city, meaning that it would have landed close to the 1,000 per day mark that it's hitting now as it tries to take Kyiv. And it wasn't just Russian military personnel who lost their lives. Mercenary groups also saw heavy losses. That's according to Wagner's Yevgeny Prigozhin, who claimed that his group lost 20,000 men in the fighting. Still, Russia took Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And in doing so, it established that the meat grinder approach worked. Throwing soldier after soldier at Ukraine's fortifications eventually wore them down, to the point where Ukraine had to retreat. A pair of Pyrrhic victories perhaps, but victories nonetheless. Russia's approach in Kyiv may mirror that seen in these two battles for the simple fact that it gets results, albeit results that come at a massive cost of life. But there's a problem. The meat grinder approach doesn't appear to be working as well in Kyiv. As the Kyiv Independent reported in June 2024, months of meat grinding have seen Russia make very little progress in Kyiv. While Russia managed to achieve its objective of creating a buffer zone along the border between Russia and Kyiv, making it more difficult for Ukraine to attack Russian territory in the process, it's barely progressed in the region. In fact, Ukraine managed to halt Russia's offensive in June, with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg summing up the situation. They tried and they failed. They made very small gains and they are paying a very high price. The Kyiv Independent also notes that Russia's use of wave infantry tactics, such as those seen in Avdiivka and Bakhmut, has been one of its biggest advantages in the war. Russia's population is much larger than Ukraine's, and it has a larger military, meaning it also has a bigger pool of recruits. However, the sheer rate of casualties has also forced Russia into sending inadequately trained soldiers to the front lines. Remember that point, it will be important later. For now, Putin seems happy to just throw wave after wave of soldiers at Kyiv, which brings us to the second reason Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day. Putin doesn't seem to care how many soldiers he loses as long as he wins. That lack of regard for his own people is demonstrated by Putin's willingness to use ex-convicts as soldiers in Russia's army. In an October 2023 report, Euronews made this abundantly clear when talking about two men, Denis Stepanov and Vladimir V. The former had been arrested for burning down a house in Siberia, killing 2 women in the process. As for the latter, he'd entered a drunken argument with his wife that escalated into a brawl. That fight continued to get worse until Vladimir V struck and killed his wife's 4-year-old daughter. What does this have to do with Putin's disregard for his people? Both men were former members of the Wagner mercenary group, which Putin has been more than happy to send to the front lines in Ukraine. Euronews calls this the tip of the iceberg, noting that members of this group have been accused of war crimes ranging from murder to rape and robbery of Ukrainian citizens. It also has a track record of torturing and executing those who attempt to desert the war. That brutality sums up what Wagner has brought to the Ukraine war. Its former leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, supposedly hired thousands of convicts to bolster his ranks. Each was promised a pardon in exchange for their service, though, as we learned earlier, around 20,000 of them died in the assault on Bakhmut. Putin approves of using convicts to fight against Ukraine, saying in September 2022 that those who fight have redeemed themselves in the eyes of himself and Russian society. Everyone can make some mistakes, they once did, Putin claimed, but they gave their lives for the motherland and fully redeemed themselves. Giving their lives is precisely what these former convicts did. Several who spoke of their experiences in Bakhmut said that Russian soldiers were being killed like mosquitoes, while another claiming that he kept a grenade in his vest so that he could detonate it whenever he was captured by Ukraine's troops. In all cases, these convicts were sent into the meat grinder because Putin simply didn't care enough about who he was sending into Ukraine or what they did when they got there. He also didn't care enough for his own people back home to ensure they were protected from the convicts who returned. By granting them full pardons for fighting in Ukraine, he placed Russian citizens at risk. Euronews highlighted at least 2 instances where returning soldiers killed Russian civilians. None of it matters to Putin as long as he wins the war. The Hill also dug into Putin's recruitment tactics in a November 2023 article. It claims that while there are surely soldiers in Russia's military who are fighting due to patriotism and belief in Putin's cause, many more fight simply because they believe they have no other choice. They're not wrong. Putin has ramped punishments for those who refuse to fight or surrender voluntarily while in Ukraine. Each faces imprisonment of up to 10 years for their actions, meaning Putin is so intent on getting as many people into Ukraine as he can that he's willing to ruin the lives of those who don't wish to join his war. The punishment situation is so bad that October 2023 saw US officials claiming that Russia was executing soldiers who attempted to retreat during the Avdiivka offensive. The message being sent to soldiers is clear: die fighting Ukraine or be killed by Russia itself. There's also a racist element to Putin's recruitment. That's according to The Hill, which claims that Russia's general staff overwhelmingly forces its recruitment efforts on non-ethnic Russian regions, which are typically languishing in poverty due to their separation from the Russian mainland. The rationale here is that Russia can recruit from these regions by promising money, suggesting Putin believes he can buy his way to forcing people to sacrifice their lives for his cause. It all adds up to a leader who is willing to send anybody to die on Ukraine's front lines, which brings us back to Russia losing 1,000 people per day. Putin doesn't care. His country contains enough people for him to simply be able to replace those Russia loses. Russia's leader has shown he's willing to use ex-convicts to win his war, regardless of the long-term ramifications, and that he will imprison those who he conscripts if they refuse to fight. He's also hiring anybody from anywhere as long as they'll fight for Russia. It's a combination of a ragtag approach to keeping his military stocked and a dictatorial approach to the war. Russians will fight for Russia because Putin commands it. They will die for Russia for the same reason. This complete lack of regard for the fate of thousands of soldiers Putin sends to the front lines also has a knock-on effect that brings us to our third reason why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day: training. Or rather, the lack thereof, and the impact that poor training has on Russia's military and its ability to carry out effective operations. Opinions on Russia's military training standards have circulated since the Ukraine war began, though they intensified as the war entered its second year. In May 2023, Newsweek published an article examining a British intelligence assessment that claimed Russia's ground forces were primarily made up of poorly trained mobilized reservists. In other words, the 300,000 conscripts Putin forced onto the front lines in September 2022. The report also notes that these reservists are being forced to use antiquated equipment, leaving them in a position where they're practically untrained and have weapons on which they can't rely. Combining this inadequate training with the loss of many of its elite brigades during the early months of the war means Russia has operational problems. Its veterans are dying off, leaving poorly trained reservists to take over. Those reservists' lack of training means they're less capable of carrying out complex operations, meaning they're more than likely to be killed or wounded on the front lines. The sheer number of deaths Russia is experiencing has even forced it to change how it trains its soldiers. That's according to a December 2023 Newsweek report, which says Russia is changing its methods to prepare its recruits for intense combat operations they'll face on the front lines. The report notes that Russia has lost up to 87% of its initial active-duty ground troops by December 2023, with spikes recorded in the assaults on Avdiivka and Bakhmut. Newsweek quotes the Kremlin-aligned Russian newspaper Izvestia, which claims Russia's training is being adapted to help soldiers survive in difficult situations. Note the use of the term survive rather than win. Russia created a draft document to outline these changes in training, with Plekhanov Russia University Associate Professor Colonel Alexander Perenziev noting that the changes intend to help Russia discover the qualities its troops lack. Physical training is the basis that allows soldiers and officers to effectively carry out their combat missions and survive in difficult situations, claims Perenziev. That approach has led to Russia considering offering pay bonuses of between 15% and 100% of a soldier's salary for any who excel in the physical aspects of their training. These changes suggest that Russia recognizes its training deficiencies, but they may be too little, too late. Worse yet, there's no guarantee that these changes will be widespread enough to encompass every soldier Russia sends into Ukraine. In March 2024, Business Insider reported on a Washington Post article in which Ukrainian soldiers discussed what they saw when fighting in Avdiivka. The soldiers claimed that many of Russia's soldiers were just confused over the roles they were supposed to play, noting that there were massive inconsistencies both in how individual Russian soldiers performed and the equipment they had. There were some with little more than uniforms and basic rifles, while others had more advanced equipment, according to a Ukrainian marksman named Shved. Other soldiers discussed Russia's wave-based approach, claiming that Russia started sending waves of inexperienced, poorly trained, and older soldiers into attacks at least 3 times per day. Again, we come back to Putin's meat grinder approach, in which it seems that the loss of dozens of soldiers to take the life of one Ukrainian appears to be an acceptable strategy. The Institute for the Study of War dug deeper into this wave approach. It says that Russia likes to alternate with its waves. If the first contains inexperienced and poorly trained soldiers, the second will contain veterans who are much more capable. In essence, Putin appears to be using alternative wave attacks to soak up Ukrainian ammunition, followed by the experienced waves coming in to cause more damage in the hope that Ukraine is less capable of fighting back. Not only does this approach mean that Russia stems the bleeding in terms of its rapid losses of elite and more experienced forces, but it also provides a reason for its poor training. The waves being sent in to die don't need much training. They just need to be people who can soak up Ukraine's bullets so that the more experienced soldiers can cause damage. It's a strategy that worked in Avdiivka, albeit with the loss of thousands of soldiers, and it appears to be one that Putin is using to try and take Kyiv. So we're starting to see a confluence of issues that explain why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day. Those losses are built into its strategy, with the inexperienced and poorly trained being fed into the meat grinder to create room for more experienced operators to do their jobs. That strategy is only viable because Putin cares very little about what happens to his soldiers on the field. As long as they win, it doesn't matter how many Russia loses. The Kremlin's talk of changing its training methods is practically irrelevant in these circumstances. Soldiers will still die by the thousands because of the way they're attacking Ukrainian positions. Which brings us to another reason why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day: low morale. On the surface, poor morale may not seem like it would mean much for the Russian army. It could even be considered a standard feature. Most soldiers don't want to be there and have been conscripted under threat of punishment. However, the morale issue plays into Russia's extensive losses because of the impact it has on Russia's ability to carry out effective operations. That's according to the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, which says that low morale is the foremost weakness across Russia's infantry units. That's a problem because low morale leads to poor unit cohesion and inter-unit cooperation, according to the RUSI. In other words, having poorly trained soldiers who don't want to be on the front lines leads to operations going south because those soldiers don't have their hearts in what they're doing. Compare that to Ukraine soldiers who are fighting tooth and nail for a cause in which they believe, and the suggestion is that many of Russia's soldiers are falling because they don't have enough desire for the fight. That's assuming they fight at all. In April 2024, Ukrainian military intelligence reported that over 18,000 Russian soldiers stationed in the southern military district had deserted their posts. Of that 18,000, 12,000 belonged to the 8th Combined Arms Army, with 10,000 of those being mobilized conscripts. In other words, reservists who have been called up to the Russian army and who clearly don't want to be there. Reporting on the situation, the Kyiv Independent also highlighted that many of the conscripts Russia mobilized in 2022 have been pressured into signing contracts to stay with the army. Again, we see Putin's disregard for his own soldiers. He doesn't care how the soldiers got there or what they actually want. He simply cares about having control over them so he can use them to fight against Ukraine. What's most notable about these desertions is that the 18,000 soldiers face punishment if they're caught. As mentioned earlier, Putin has created a 10-year sentence for deserters, meaning those who are running from the Russian army are so terrified of what's in store for them in Ukraine that they're willing to risk the gulag to get away. Think about how hard a soldier like that is going to fight for Russia. Not very is the likely answer. Now add to this the chaos that losing so many soldiers to desertion has on military operations. A Russian officer or general who's trying to organize an attack must constantly work under the assumption that his soldiers are struggling with morale and may possibly desert. If the latter happens, the attack is weakened, meaning those who remain face a high possibility of being killed. So Russia's heavy losses could be down to many of its attacks being conducted in a weakened form to what was originally intended. Fewer soldiers on the field means less firepower, making the rest easier to pick off for Ukraine. Yet another reason why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day. Finally, we return to strategy and tactics, or more specifically, force design. Russia's military simply isn't built to fight against Ukraine without the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. That was the shared opinion of Rob Lee and Michael Kaufman when they wrote a June 2022 commentary piece for War on the Rocks. They highlighted how Russia's assumption that it would enjoy an easy victory in the early weeks of the war had led it to entering Ukraine with a lack of planning, terrible force employment, and even worse preparation. But far more damaging to Russia, the duo claims, is how it's attempted to adapt when its initial plans failed. Conscious choices and trade-offs lie at the source of many of the most severe problems Russia's military faces, the two claim. The article notes that Russia had a shortage of manpower as far back as June 2022, a shortage it has since attempted to rectify with conscription, contracted soldiers, and the hiring of ex-convicts and mercenary groups to fight on its behalf. Leo and Kaufman claim that Russia failed so spectacularly in the early days of the war due to the military approach it had taken since the fall of the Soviet Union. It abandoned its conscript-heavy army of old, creating a smaller standing force in the process. It also focused on ensuring contracted soldiers made up the majority of its armed forces. The idea was simple: create a smaller, better-equipped army than it had during the Soviet era. The approach was faulty for two reasons. First, it ended up being rolled back, to an extent, in 2013, as many in Russia considered its new standing force to be too small to achieve victory in either a regional or large-scale war. This led to further restructuring, with Lee and Kaufman highlighting the major issue. Assuming a brigade of 3,500 soldiers, it's likely that the brigade would have only 2,500 active duty soldiers during peacetime. Given that a further 30% of the brigade would likely consist of poorly trained conscripts, this means that only 1,700 of the 3,500 would be considered deployable. In other words, Russia's brigades were operating at half capacity at the beginning of the Ukraine war, with everything it's done since essentially trying to play catch-up. Again, it's an example of Russia fighting with weakened units, meaning it experiences more deaths than it should. The second reason is that the idea of having a smaller and well-equipped army only works when you can get the equipment part of that equation right. That's another thing that Russia has failed to do in the Ukraine war. In addition to the earlier mentions of Putin failing to properly equip his soldiers, as seen in Avdiivka, reports abound of Russia relying on Soviet-era equipment to fight against Ukraine. The Jamestown Foundation notes that Russia has been pulling tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery out of storage since the war began. Much of this equipment dates back to the 1940s through to the 1960s, meaning it's been mothballed in poorly maintained warehouses ever since. Not only is this equipment not fit for purpose when faced with modern weapons, such as those Ukraine can access thanks to the military aid it's receiving from other countries, but poor maintenance increases the likelihood of faults. If soldiers can't rely on their equipment to work as it should, they're again more likely to die when assaulting Ukrainian positions. Each of these issues contributes to Russia losing 1,000 soldiers per day. It has a strategy of sending wave after wave of soldiers to take a position. It's a strategy that has worked in Avdiivka and Bakhmut, meaning Putin is confident it'll also work in Kyiv. The meat grinder has gotten results because Russia has the manpower to make it work, along with a leader who doesn't care how many soldiers Russia loses as long as it gets results. Putin has shown he's willing to use practically anybody in his army, including ex-convicts and inexperienced conscripts, and that Russia's wave-based approach alternates so the less experienced soldiers are used to soak up the bullets during assaults. Add inconsistent training, low morale, old equipment, and the many trade-offs Russia has implemented in its force design in the years prior to the war, and you have a recipe for 1,000 deaths per day. The final question is simple. Can Russia keep fighting, regardless of these high numbers? The simple answer is yes. Given that Putin has already shown how little he cares about ensuring his soldiers are trained and equipped well enough to fight in Ukraine, he can just keep sending more into the meat grinder. The same Business Insider report that highlighted Russia's loss of 1,000 soldiers per day also notes that US officials believe that Russia is replenishing those numbers by recruiting between 25,000 and 30,000 soldiers per month. Add to that the possibility of a second mobilization. In March 2024, Radio Free Europe reported on the opinions of 4 anonymous sources close to the Kremlin, all of whom believe that Russia's president is planning a second wave of mobilization. It's unknown how large this wave will be, though it's possible that it will be as large as that seen in September 2022. That would mean another 300,000 conscripts flooding into Ukraine to get jammed into the meat grinder. Putin's strategy is clear. Unable to compete with Ukraine on the tactical level, in addition to facing a Ukraine that's bolstered by having access to modern Western arms, he aims to win through manpower alone. He leads a country of over 141 million people, 46.4 million of whom are considered fit for service, according to Global Firepower. By contrast, Ukraine's population is just 43.3 million, with 15.4 million being fit for service. Russia has around 3 times the manpower and, as Putin has shown time and time again, it will try to use that manpower to overwhelm Ukrainian positions regardless of the human cost. Will Russia's approach work in the end? Can Russia sustain itself in Ukraine while losing 1,000 soldiers per day? Might Putin start to see his power base erode at home if he continues to show such blatant disregard for the lives of Russia's soldiers? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Russia is running out of everything: planes, ships, soldiers, tanks, or click this other video instead.